In the dead of winter, beneath the cold stone arches of Rome's Lateran Basilica, a corpse was dragged from its tomb and placed upon a throne. Not buried, not burned, displayed, dressed in papal robes, propped upright, and forced to stand trial. The year was 897 AD, and the man on trial had already been dead for 9 months. But that didn't matter. His accuser was the new pope, Pope Stephen VI, a man so obsessed with vengeance, so consumed by hatred, that even death was not enough to silence his enemy. They called it the Cadaver Synod, and it remains one of the most macabre events in the history of the Catholic Church. But behind the spectacle of a corpse on trial lies something even darker, a secret war of bloodlines, blackmail, and whispered rituals. Because this wasn't just about politics. This was about power, unholy power. And the truth may lie not in theology, but in necromancy. This is not just a story of corruption. It's a story of possession, of a church haunted from within. And once you learn what really happened, you may never see the Vatican the same way again. Now let's begin. It began with a scream, muffled by stone walls, swallowed by the cold Roman night. Monks in dark robes whispered of a presence in the crypt. Candles flickered and went out for no reason. And when they opened the tomb, the body was still there, still intact. Unnaturally so. This was the corpse of Pope Formosus, once the supreme pontiff of the Catholic Church. Now, an embalmed shell of skin and bone, buried beneath the Basilica of St. Peter. But death had not ended his story. In fact, it had only just begun. Formosus had ruled as pope during one of the most volatile periods in church history. Rome was not the sacred city we imagine today. It was a crumbling war zone of rival factions, noble families, and shadow popes installed like chess pieces. Bloodlines determined salvation more than scripture. And Formosus, for all his piety, had made enemies. Deadly enemies. His papacy was marked by controversy. He had supported rival claimants to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, enraging the powerful Spolitan dynasty. He was accused, though never proven, of forging alliances with Eastern heretics, of speaking with pagans, and even, some whispered, of consulting books that no bishop should ever touch. When he died in 896, many thought the chaos would end. They were wrong, because his successor, Pope Stephen VI, would not let the past rest. Stephen hated Formosus with a rage that bordered on mania. He claimed Formosus had been a false pope, that his election was illegitimate, that all the ordinations he performed were invalid, that the man had defiled the Holy See. But why bring a corpse to trial? Why not simply erase his memory, as had been done with countless others? The answer lies in a ritual older than Christianity itself, a practice that transcends logic and law. In the ancient world, putting the dead on trial wasn't about justice. It was about dominance, and sometimes about binding a soul. What Stephen VI did next shocked even the most jaded cardinals. He ordered Formosus's body exhumed, stripped, dressed again in papal robes, and seated on a throne in the papal court. The church called it the Synodus Horrenda, the dreadful synod. But among the Roman poor and the secret societies that watched from the shadows, it was known by another name, the necromancer's trial. And what was truly on trial wasn't just a dead man's legacy. It was the soul of the church itself. Rome in the late 9th century was not a city of saints. It was a slaughterhouse wrapped in silk. The Catholic Church, swollen with wealth and political influence, had become the greatest prize in the Western world. And men were willing to kill, torture, and betray to seize it. Popes were no longer chosen for holiness, but for lineage, loyalty, or blackmail. And every man who sat on the papal throne knew he could be murdered just as quickly as he was crowned. This was the world Pope Formosus inherited, a world ruled not by faith, but by factions. On one side stood the powerful Spolitan dynasty, a family of warlords and kings who believed the church existed to serve their empire. On the other, a loose alliance of nobles, bishops, and foreign powers who saw the papacy as a tool to resist imperial domination. Formosus was caught between them. Early in his career, he had fled Rome after being accused of ambition and treason. His enemies claimed he had conspired to usurp the papacy while still a bishop, an unforgivable sin. Though eventually pardoned, the rumors never faded. Even after becoming pope, his reign was hounded by betrayal. He crowned Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor, an open challenge to the Spolitans, who had long controlled the imperial title. In retaliation, the Spolitans stormed Rome, imprisoned Formosus, and left him to die in misery. He was buried quickly, quietly. But the factions were not done with him, because in the shadows of cathedrals and palaces, a new game had begun. Pope Stephen VI rose to power with the Spolitans' blessing, but his hold on the city was fragile. Whispers swirled through the alleys and catacombs that Stephen had been initiated into a darker tradition, one far older than Christianity, that he had not only conspired to try a dead man, but that he planned to bind him, to silence his legacy through spiritual desecration. It sounds insane until you understand the deeper context. At the time, many in Rome believed that a soul could not rest if its body was disturbed unjustly. Worse still, that putting a corpse on trial could condemn its spirit to eternal unrest, tethering it to the earth in shame and agony. Some called it justice, others called it sorcery, and the practice had precedent. In ancient pagan rituals, corpses were exhumed to reverse curses, seize power, or remove a spiritual threat. It wasn't about judgment. It was about dominance over the afterlife. When Stephen announced the Cadaver Synod, many cardinals protested. Some wept. A few vanished. But none could stop it, because the trial was not just an act of hate. It was a ceremony. And as the preparations began, dressing the corpse, summoning witnesses, readying the papal court, something shifted in Rome. The air grew heavier. Birds stopped singing. Even the guards posted outside the basilica began to complain of nightmares. They said they heard Formosus speaking, that his eyes were open, that his lips moved. Most dismissed it as superstition, but others, those who still remembered the ancient rites buried in the Vatican vaults, knew better. This was no longer politics. It was spiritual war. And soon, the church itself would become the battlefield. Before the Cadaver Synod began, Rome trembled, not from war, nor from plague, but from something far more elusive, the feeling that something unholy was awakening beneath its foundations. Rumors spread like rot, that the Pope's private chambers were being sealed at night with black wax, that a silver key had been taken from the sanctum of Saint Sylvester, an artifact said to unlock the forbidden vaults beneath the Lateran Palace, that Pope Stephen VI had stopped attending Mass entirely, choosing instead to meet with a strange group of monks in candlelit silence long after midnight. To the public, these were just rumors. To the clerics who had served under Formosus, they were signs. Signs that Stephen wasn't preparing a trial. He was preparing a ritual. Long before Christianity swept across Europe, Rome was a place of gods, tombs, and unspeakable rites. And not all of that vanished with the rise of the church. Hidden beneath basilicas and cathedrals were remnants of older faiths, shrines to forgotten deities, bone-filled catacombs, and slabs stained with sacrificial blood. In private circles of power, certain practices survived. Occult historians refer to this period as the Sub-Rose Age, a time when church leaders secretly borrowed from the pagan world to secure power. Ancient spellcraft was rebranded as divine punishment. Necromancy became trial by corpse. And instead of admitting spiritual warfare, they called it heresy control. Stephen VI knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just condemning Formosus's memory. He was using the Cadaver Synod as a channel, a symbolic inversion of justice meant to spiritually dismember his enemy. The corpse was propped up on a throne and interrogated like a living man. A deacon was forced to stand behind the decaying body and answer on its behalf, moving its arm like a puppet. The grotesque mimicry was no accident. It echoed an Etruscan rite used to humiliate enemies in death by parodying their final trial. Stephen accused Formosus of blasphemy, of corruption, of betraying the very foundations of the church. But beneath the legal language, something else was happening. Some noticed that the trial was held during a rare lunar alignment, a period known in astrological texts as the Veil of Mercury, a time associated with deception, spirit channeling, and the invocation of restless dead. Even the setting, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, was significant. Beneath its altar lay ancient Roman burial chambers, forgotten tunnels, murals scratched out, sacrifices performed in ages past. As the corpse sat robed in decayed finery, witnesses described an overwhelming stench, one far worse than natural decay. Some claim they saw steam rising from the body's mouth. One deacon collapsed. Another fled Rome. Still, the trial continued. Because this wasn't just spectacle. It was spiritual erasure. Formosus was found guilty. His papacy declared null. His acts, his ordinations, all voided as if he had never lived. Then came the final act. Stephen ordered the corpse stripped. The fingers that had given holy blessings were hacked off, one by one. His body was dragged through the streets and tossed into the Tiber River like refuse. But the river didn't keep him. Days later, the body washed ashore, where monks secretly retrieved it and buried it in an unmarked grave. And after that, the nightmares began. By the time Pope Stephen VI returned to his chambers, something had changed in him. His eyes, once piercing, cold, and deliberate, were now sunken. His hands trembled when holding the Eucharist. He spoke in tongues when alone. Even his allies began to fear him. The Cadaver Synod had ended, but its consequences had only begun to unfold. At first, Stephen was triumphant. The Spolitan lords praised him. The rival bishops fell silent. The records were altered, the images of Formosus defaced. It was as if the man had never existed. But the church is not so easily cleansed of blood, especially when that blood had been sacrificed, because that is what many began to believe, that the Cadaver Synod had not been a legal proceeding, but a dark ritual masked as justice. Witnesses close to Stephen reported that in the days following the trial, he refused to sleep. He muttered beneath his breath constantly, repeating fragments of Latin scripture in reverse. Some claimed he had locked himself away with an old manuscript, not a Bible, but a forbidden text that predated the church. A text believed to contain Enochian invocations. The rumors gained weight when strange things began to happen inside the Lateran palace. One priest was found hanging upside down from the rafters of the chapel, his eyes gouged out. Another burst into flames during Mass. No source, no explanation. Chanting was heard at night, echoing from the basilica walls. Rome, already unstable, now seethed with panic. Because something had been unleashed. And it wasn't just politics. The people of Rome, steeped in superstition and sacred terror, began calling Stephen Il Papa Maledetto, the cursed pope. And those who had quietly supported the Cadaver Synod suddenly vanished from public life. Some were poisoned. Some disappeared. Others were found drowned in the same river that had spat out Formosus's body. Then came the most chilling sign of all. A group of fishermen pulled something tangled from the Tiber, a body, half decayed, wrapped in papal vestments. No one knew how it had returned. The monks who had buried Formosus in secret had sworn the grave was sealed. But there he was. Again. Stephen ordered it burned. The monks refused. They said the body must not be touched again. Not by hands defiled by sin. Not after what had been done. Shortly after, the bells of St. Peter's tolled at the wrong hour, just after midnight. No one had rung them, and no one could stop them. Stephen began to unravel. He accused his servants of conspiring with the dead. He excommunicated a bishop who simply mentioned Formosus by name. He held court alone, talking to empty thrones. One day he collapsed in the apse, whispering, "He won't stop looking at me." The Vatican records call it madness. But the older accounts, preserved in private monastery scrolls, suggest something far worse. They speak of possession, of a spirit tethered by rage, of a pope who had broken the veil between the living and the damned. The Cadaver Synod had not only cursed Formosus, it had invited something in, and the church would soon pay the price. The basilica was silent when they brought him in. No hymns, no prayers, only the creaking of wheels as the coffin was dragged across the ancient stone floor. Then a thud. The coffin was opened, and the dead pope rose again. Witnesses swore they saw Formosus's body move, though it had been buried for 9 months. Some claimed his skin, though blackened and sunken, bore no maggots. His vestments hung like funeral curtains from brittle bones. He was seated on the throne of judgment, the chair of St. Peter, and propped up like a grotesque marionette. The crown was not placed upon his head. Instead, a deacon stood behind him, answering for him, moving his hand like a puppet, a mockery of free will. And in front of this scene, this nightmare masquerading as a courtroom, Pope Stephen VI stood and began to scream. He screamed of blasphemy, of betrayal, of sacrilege so foul it had stained the entire church. He called Formosus a liar, a heretic, a usurper of the Holy See. He accused him of ascending the papacy illegally, of breaking canon law by returning to Rome after being exiled. He claimed all the ordinations and baptisms performed by Formosus were null, damning thousands of souls in the process. But behind the accusations was something deeper, a thirst for spiritual vengeance. Because Stephen wasn't just trying to erase Formosus's legacy. He was trying to undo the man's very sanctity, to declare him unclean in both body and spirit. And to do that, he needed to desecrate him in ritual. One by one, the charges were read aloud. The deacon, trembling, answered for the corpse. "Yes, I confess. Yes, I am guilty." The words echoed like curses, heavy and unnatural. Then came the judgment. Formosus was stripped of his robes. His 3 fingers of benediction were severed. The very fingers used to give blessings, now removed in an act of sacred mutilation. Stephen, consumed by fury, demanded that the body be thrown into a pauper's grave. When the people refused, he ordered it cast into the Tiber River, the same waters used for purification in ancient Roman rituals. But the river did not keep him. Days later, Formosus's body was found floating downstream, eerily preserved. Monks retrieved it in secret, washing the decay with oil and herbs, and reburied him beneath the floor of a small convent chapel. That should have been the end. But it wasn't. The Synod had triggered something inside Rome. A spiritual sickness. A series of unexplained fires. Mirrors cracking in monasteries. Statues of saints toppling face first in churches. And the dreams. Dozens of clerics began reporting the same dream. A man dressed in mold-ridden robes, standing in the Tiber with arms raised, eyes weeping blood. Some believed it was a manifestation of guilt. Others feared it was a curse, a sign that the soul of Formosus had been trapped, not in heaven or hell, but between, and that the Synod hadn't ended his influence, only magnified it. What Stephen VI had done was unprecedented, but what followed would be even darker. Because now, the Vatican would begin to split, and the curse of the dead pope would turn inward, tearing the church apart from within. The Cadaver Synod had succeeded in one regard. It made history. But not in the way Pope Stephen VI had hoped. The church did not become purified. It became haunted. In the weeks after the Synod, a wave of illness swept through the Lateran clergy. Priests suffered seizures in the middle of sermons. Choir boys fainted when entering the nave. One bishop reportedly scratched his own face until it bled, screaming that worms were crawling beneath his skin. The stench of rot lingered inside the basilica, even after the corpse was removed. No amount of incense could purge it. But the most disturbing symptom infected Stephen himself. His mind began to fracture. He forbade his staff from saying the name Formosus. He claimed to see shadows moving beneath doorways, voices whispering behind icons. In one sermon, he tore open his vestments and shouted, "The dead man has my heart in his hands." Those closest to the papal court began to wonder. Had Stephen merely gone mad from guilt? Or had something attached itself to him? Something left behind when Formosus was exhumed? Whispers of possession began to circulate. Certain clergymen believed the Synod had unintentionally created a spiritual link between the living pope and the dead one. A ritual mirror that couldn't be broken simply by verdict or violence. They pointed to ancient Hebrew texts buried in the Vatican library, texts that warned of the tethered dead, spirits condemned to wander the mortal realm when desecrated unjustly. Others claimed Stephen had opened a door that could not be closed. In one document, hidden for centuries in the archives of Monte Cassino Abbey, a monk wrote, "Our Holy Father walks like a man in a dream. His eyes are not his own. He weeps without cause. He laughs in darkness. I fear he is no longer alone in his flesh." Rome, now gripped by fear, turned against him. The public that once praised his purge began to see signs of divine wrath. Lightning struck the Lateran twice in 1 month. A statue of St. Peter cracked down the center. Children were born disfigured. An earthquake shook the city, centered directly beneath the papal palace. By summer, the Vatican had become a prison. The nobles who supported Stephen abandoned him. The Spolitans, fearing retribution from the growing anti-Synod movement, withdrew their protection. Stephen, isolated and unraveling, attempted to flee the city in secret. He was captured by a mob of enraged Romans, dragged from his chambers, stripped of his papal insignia, and thrown into a dungeon. There, in a stone cell beneath the crumbling basilica, he screamed for 3 nights. Until finally, someone entered and strangled him with a rope. No trial, no justice, no absolution. The church records listed his death as an act of madness. But the unofficial accounts claimed the opposite, that his madness was not his own. And when they buried him, no rites were performed, no candles lit, no prayers offered, because the church feared what still lingered in his bones, and what might rise next. Pope Stephen VI was dead, strangled in the dark, buried like a criminal. But the terror he unleashed did not die with him. Instead, it spread like a plague, invisible, psychological, and deeply spiritual, infecting not only the halls of the Vatican, but the very office of the papacy itself. For the next 3 years, Rome descended into chaos. 7 popes would rise and fall in quick succession. Assassinations, conspiracies, sudden illnesses. No pontiff remained in power long enough to bring stability. Some were poisoned. One was dragged from the altar and beaten to death by a mob. The Roman people, who once feared the wrath of kings, now whispered of a greater curse, the curse of Formosus. They believed the church had desecrated a holy man, that his soul, tethered by humiliation and sacrilege, now haunted the papal line, and the patterns seemed to prove them right. The Vatican's own records during this period become strange, disjointed, entries left blank, entire months missing from archives. Even the scribes, those who had documented centuries of papal decrees, wrote cryptic notes in the margins. The throne turns to ash. The keys do not open. His shadow returns with every sunrise. But not everyone believed it was a curse. Some believed it was retribution, a divine act of justice for the synod's sacrilege. And others, especially the monks who had secretly retrieved Formosus's body, believed something far more dangerous, that the ritual had worked, but not in the way Stephen intended. That by exhuming Formosus, dressing him in stolen robes, forcing false confessions from dead lips, Stephen had not erased his enemy. He had elevated him. That the humiliation had transformed Formosus into a spiritual martyr, a figure not of shame, but of supernatural presence. One not constrained by flesh or time. One who now hovered over the papacy like a ghost king, silencing and dethroning any man who came near the corrupted throne. In 897, just months after Stephen's death, Pope Romanus tried to restore order. He annulled all decrees made during the Cadaver Synod. He declared Formosus innocent, and he ordered his body exhumed once more, but this time to be reburied with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. But Romanus, too, would fall, dethroned within months. Then came Pope Theodore II, who ruled for just 20 days before mysteriously dying. He, too, had supported the restoration of Formosus. And he, too, died suddenly. Finally, Pope John IX tried to erase the synod from history altogether. He forbade future trials of the dead, ordered all records of the Cadaver Synod destroyed, and attempted to end the cycle of violence. But the Vatican was already fractured, the clergy divided, and in hushed corners of monasteries, a darker fear remained, that Formosus's spirit had not been appeased, that by restoring him in death, they had only prolonged the tether, that the throne of St. Peter had been marked, and that every man who sat upon it would carry the stain, unless the true ritual, the one Stephen had botched, was completed. But what that ritual was, no one dared say aloud. To understand the true horror of what happened during and after the Cadaver Synod, we must look beneath the surface, beneath the Church's official records, beneath the whitewashed chronicles, and into the forbidden libraries of early Vatican power. Because buried in the catacombs of monasteries across Europe are fragments of texts the Church never intended to preserve. They speak of ritual law not found in the Bible, of exorcisms reversed, of blessings corrupted, of rites that bind the soul instead of freeing it. And in these fragments, there's one chilling pattern. The trial of the dead was not new. It had precedents. In the Sumerian city of Eridu, there are cuneiform tablets describing how kings would place the corpses of rivals on trial to enslave their spirits in the afterlife, a process known as namtar. In ancient Egypt, unworthy pharaohs were desecrated posthumously to strip them of their divine identity, condemning them to wander the Duat forever. But it was the Etruscans, early inhabitants of Italy, who left behind the darkest version. They believed that if a corpse was publicly humiliated and forced to confess false sins under ritual duress, their soul could be transformed into a kind of guardian phantom, a spirit bound to protect or destroy a lineage or institution, depending on the ritual's intent. And disturbingly, one such rite bears a nearly identical structure to the Cadaver Synod. One fragment, discovered in the ruins of a 5th-century Umbrian chapel, describes a rite called the votum mortis. The body must be 9 months dead. It must be exhumed, robed in ceremonial dress. It must be judged by a spiritual superior. Its sacred limbs, the hands of oath, must be severed. Finally, it must be cast into running water during a lunar conjunction. These conditions match the Cadaver Synod exactly. Down to the river, down to the lunar phase, down to the month. So was Pope Stephen VI performing a forgotten rite rather than a spontaneous act of madness? Evidence suggests yes. A 12th-century monk named Brother Elias, writing in a secret codex known as Libellus Iter, claimed to have seen early papal documents referencing an ancestral rite of final judgment, passed down orally among a hidden circle of prelates known only as the Order of Peter's Thorn. According to Elias, this rite was believed to bind the sins of a pontiff to his successor's flesh, allowing those sins to be ritually exorcised or absorbed. Stephen VI, consumed by hatred, may have attempted the rite without understanding its consequences. He didn't cleanse the church. He corrupted it further. Because the moment Formosus was forced to confess, his soul became ensnared, and the mutilation sealed it. But without the correct completion, a final burial under sacred salt, a triple-locked tomb, the ritual sealing of the mouth, the rite remained open. An open ritual is a dangerous thing. It becomes a wound, a spiritual infection, and through it, anything can pass. Some modern scholars believe this moment marked the first true occult fracture in Vatican history, a tear between official doctrine and hidden magic, and that everything since, from the Borgias to the exorcism archives of the 20th century, traces back to this act. A dead pope, a broken rite, and a church that has never fully healed. Because you can bury the body, you can burn the records, but you can't silence a spirit that's been trapped between worlds. For centuries, the Church has denied that the Cadaver Synod was anything more than a political travesty, an aberration born of one pope's madness. But within the oldest and darkest corners of the Vatican, there are signs that even this official version may be a cover story. Because once you strip away the theological language, once you ignore the sanitizing ink of official scribes, you're left with only one conclusion. Pope Stephen VI performed a necromantic rite. And he may not have been the only one. Let's look at the facts. Necromancy, in its purest definition, is communication with the dead for the purpose of power, whether that power is knowledge, influence, or spiritual manipulation. The elements of necromancy were all present at the synod. Corpse exhumed and publicly displayed ritualistic interrogation and forced confession, sacred objects used in profane ways, body mutilated, soul desecrated, disposal via symbolic running water, a purification method common in Roman and Etruscan rites. Even the timing of the event points toward calculated ritual, not madness. It took place during a lunar conjunction, a phase used in summoning rites across numerous ancient traditions. The synod, in essence, was a ritualized spiritual trial cloaked in canonical terms. Still skeptical? Let's turn to the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archives. Among thousands of volumes restricted from public view, there are texts that discuss the Cadaver Synod not as a legal proceeding, but as a spiritual inversion. One document, the Fragmentum Excommunicationis Inversi, written in 1043 by Cardinal Sigeric of Sutri, describes the synod as a mirror ritual, inverted in faith but occult in form, designed to shatter legacy and bind the unseen. Cardinal Sigeric further claims that Formosus's soul was not released, that he had been spiritually tethered to the chair of St. Peter, and that his return from the Tiber signaled the rite's failure. Worse, he suggests that something else entered through that open rite, a foreign presence, a spiritual parasite. This belief explains why Stephen VI died screaming, why the next 7 popes were torn down, why the Lateran itself became plagued with nightmares and unexplained deaths. It may even explain a far more disturbing detail. The crypts beneath the basilica were sealed not long after Stephen's death. Some say to prevent looting. Others say to prevent egress. And here's the most damning piece of all. In 1641, a Jesuit priest named Father Matthias Borgia, yes, of that Borgia bloodline, uncovered a sealed iron box beneath the Lateran sacristy. Inside were 3 items: a finger bone, labeled Formosus, a papal ring, cracked and blackened, a parchment scroll, bound in lambskin, titled simply, Ritus Dominii Mortui, the Rite of the Dead Lord. The scroll has never been released to the public, but according to Vatican insiders, it describes the full ritual performed at the Cadaver Synod, along with the instructions to reverse it. To this day, no reversal has ever been confirmed, and Formosus's bones remain entombed in St. Peter's Basilica. But every few decades, a new pope will order the tomb quietly sealed again. No explanation given. No ceremony. Just silent fear. Because even now, the Vatican may still believe the spirit of Pope Formosus is awake, waiting, bound. And if so, then the greatest exorcism the Church ever needed to perform still hasn't happened. Centuries have passed since the macabre spectacle of the Cadaver Synod. The Vatican has evolved, its power restored, its secrets buried deep beneath marble and myth. But the shadow of that frozen trial still lingers, like a whispered warning echoing through the ages. The Church sought to bury the past, to erase the moment when faith and fear collided with the darkest of rites. But history refuses to stay silent. The Cadaver Synod was more than political vengeance. It was an unholy ritual that shattered the boundary between life and death, law and occult power. A moment when the Church's desire for dominance led it into the realm of necromancy, an ancient, forbidden practice it never fully renounced. The consequence was a curse not only on those who participated but on the papacy itself, fractures that led to decades of instability, betrayal, and terror. For every pope who sat on St. Peter's throne after Stephen VI, the question remained, were they truly in control, or were they puppets to an unseen force, haunted by a spirit bound by hatred, mutilated by ritual, and refused rest? Today, the Vatican guards its archives jealously, hiding texts that describe the rite's true purpose, a rite meant to control not only the body but the soul of the Church. And some scholars warn that the unresolved power of the Cadaver Synod still hums beneath Rome. That beneath the basilicas, in the forgotten tunnels, the bones of Formosus and the shadows of his accusers wait, waiting for the final chapter. Because power gained through fear and occult rites is never truly free. It demands a price. One paid in blood, madness, and silence. So when you hear whispers about the Cadaver Synod, remember, this was not just a trial of a dead pope. It was a trial of the Church's soul. And some trials never end. If you found this story as chilling as the ancient bones it unearthed, subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest secrets. Leave a comment below. What do you think really happened in the shadows of the Vatican? And if you want to uncover another tale of power, betrayal, and forbidden rituals, watch our video on the Borgia curse, how a family haunted the Vatican for generations. Because history is never just history. Sometimes it's a warning.